The first light of morning did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, almost without sound, spreading across the wide land beside the Nile like a soft cloth being unfolded. Long before the sun rose above the distant horizon, the sky carried only the faintest hint of pale blue. The stars still rested overhead, though each one seemed a little less bright than before. A cool breeze moved gently across quiet fields where the day's work had not yet begun. In those peaceful moments, the villages of ancient Egypt remained almost completely still. Mud brick homes stood close together, their flat roofs holding the night's cool air for a little longer. Small courtyards rested in silence. Clay jars waited beside doorways. Simple woven baskets leaned against walls where they had been left the evening before. Sandals rested neatly on worn stone floors, ready for another familiar day. Inside one small home, a child slept beneath a rough linen cloth. The room was simple. There were no large pieces of furniture. A reed mat covered part of the floor. A clay lamp, now empty of oil, stood quietly in one corner. The smell of yesterday's bread still lingered in the warm air, mixing gently with the scent of dry earth carried through the doorway. The child had fallen asleep quickly after a long day filled with small tasks. Sleep came easily after walking dusty roads, carrying water, gathering reeds, and helping prepare the evening meal. Dreams arrived softly, though they rarely lasted long. Outside, somewhere beyond the village, the first rooster called into the fading darkness. A donkey answered with a low cry. Soon another animal stirred. Then another. The sounds remained gentle, never hurried. Morning always came this way. No one expected childhood to be separate from the rhythm of the village. Life itself was the teacher. Every sunrise quietly reminded each family that another day of work had begun, whether someone was very old, fully grown, or only beginning to understand the world. The child slowly opened sleepy eyes. For just a few peaceful breaths, there were no expectations. Only the quiet ceiling above. Only the cool air before sunrise. Only the distant sound of moving water far beyond the fields. But those moments never lasted very long. A soft voice came from another part of the room. It belonged to the child's mother. She was already awake. She had been awake long before dawn, kneeling beside a simple grinding stone. Her hands moved with calm practice as grain slowly became flour. The gentle scraping sound repeated again and again. It was one of the first sounds heard almost every morning throughout much of ancient Egypt. She did not call loudly. There was no need. The family followed the same routine every day. The child sat up slowly, rubbing tired eyes. Bare feet touched the cool floor. The air still carried enough freshness to feel pleasant against the skin, though everyone knew the heat would arrive before long. Outside, another home was already busy. An elderly grandfather carefully untied a small goat from its shelter. Across the narrow path, two brothers carried empty jars toward the village well. Further away, a fisherman quietly inspected his woven nets before walking toward the river. No one hurried. Yet no one delayed. Routine held the village together more firmly than walls ever could. The child stepped outside into the soft morning light. Dust rested undisturbed beneath small feet. The sky now glowed with gentle colors that reflected faintly across the slow-moving Nile in the distance. The river had always been there. Long before this child. Long before the parents. Long before grandparents whose names were already becoming stories. Every family depended upon its quiet waters. Every harvest depended upon its patient flooding. Every meal depended upon hands willing to rise before dawn. As the village slowly awakened, children naturally became part of everything happening around them. There was little time reserved only for play. That did not mean laughter never appeared. It certainly did. Children smiled often. They chased each other between houses. They floated little reed boats in irrigation canals. They tossed smooth stones into shallow pools. But these moments fit between responsibilities rather than replacing them. Very early in life, small hands discovered useful work. The work began gently. A little basket to carry. A younger brother to watch. Loose chickens to gather. Small bundles of firewood to collect before the sun climbed too high. No one held an official ceremony announcing that childhood had ended. There was no single morning when everyone agreed that a child had become something else. Instead, rules quietly appeared one after another. The first rule might be as simple as remembering where drinking water was stored. Another rule might involve staying close to older family members during market days. Soon another lesson arrived. Carry this basket carefully. Walk beside your father. Do not waste grain. Do not interrupt elders. Do not forget today's errands. Each instruction seemed small by itself. Together they slowly built the shape of everyday life. The child rarely questioned these expectations. Almost every friend received similar responsibilities. Looking around the village, the same pattern appeared again and again. One little girl carefully swept dust from a doorway using bundled reeds. A young boy slowly guided two sleepy goats toward a nearby pasture. Another child helped shape wet clay into small storage jars while sitting beside an experienced potter. No one described these tasks as unusual. They simply belonged to growing up. The morning became brighter. Warm sunlight reached the tops of palm trees before slowly spilling across rooftops. Birds crossed the sky in quiet groups. Some circled above the river. Others disappeared into fields where insects had begun to stir. The air gradually changed. Coolness faded. Heat quietly took its place. By now, bread baked inside several homes. The comforting smell drifted through narrow pathways between buildings. Fresh flat loaves emerged from simple clay ovens blackened by years of steady use. Children waited patiently, though everyone understood that adults working in fields often ate first. Food represented careful planning. Nothing could be wasted. Every handful of grain carried memories of planting, watering, harvesting, grinding, and baking. Even very young children understood this without anyone explaining it through long speeches. They learned by watching, by helping, by repeating. This quiet education never truly stopped. The child's father emerged carrying simple farming tools across one shoulder. The wood had become smooth after years of use. Copper edges reflected the growing sunlight. His sandals showed signs of repair more than once. Nothing useful was discarded easily. He greeted neighbors with calm nods. There were few unnecessary words. Morning belonged to preparation. Conversation often waited until evening. The child walked beside him toward the fields. Their shadows stretched long across dusty ground. Neither felt the need to fill every moment with speech. Instead, the father occasionally pointed toward something nearby. Fresh tracks left by a small animal. New reeds growing beside irrigation channels. Clouds gathering far away. Each observation quietly became another lesson. No formal classroom surrounded them. The land itself became the teacher. Soon they reached cultivated fields where green plants stood in careful rows. Water moved slowly through narrow channels dug by many hands over many seasons. Men adjusted small barriers directing precious water toward thirsty soil. Women worked nearby gathering vegetables into woven baskets. Older children carried loads too heavy for the youngest but light enough for growing bodies. Even here, there remained peaceful moments. A gentle breeze crossed the fields. Dragonflies hovered above quiet water. The river reflected bright morning light. For a little while, everything seemed balanced. Yet beneath this peaceful appearance lived countless expectations. Every family depended upon everyone else. If someone forgot a task, another person quietly carried the burden. If one child became careless while watching animals, crops might suffer. If grain spilled unnecessarily, another day might bring hunger. Responsibility arrived early because survival required it. No one wished to burden children. Life simply asked much from every member of the household. The child knelt beside the father and watched careful hands loosen dry soil around growing plants. At first, only observation was expected. Then came imitation. A smaller tool appeared. Gentle guidance followed. Not criticism. Simply correction. Move slower. Hold the handle here. Watch the roots. Leave enough space. These simple instructions settled into memory through repetition. Weeks became months. Months quietly became years. Without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, the child no longer watched the work. The child performed it. The village accepted this change naturally. No announcement marked the moment. No celebration separated yesterday from today. Childhood gently stepped aside while responsibility quietly entered. The sun climbed higher. Heat gathered across open ground until distant air shimmered softly. Workers paused briefly beneath small patches of shade whenever possible. Water jars passed carefully from one person to another. Faces glistened with sweat. Hands became dusty. Clothing clung lightly to tired bodies. Children experienced the same heat as adults. Their smaller size offered little protection beneath the powerful Egyptian sun. Still, work continued. Not because anyone enjoyed exhaustion. Because seasons could not wait. Crops followed their own quiet calendar. The Nile followed its ancient rhythm. Families adjusted themselves around both. By midday the village seemed almost silent. Most energy disappeared beneath the heavy warmth filling every street. Animals rested. Even birds sang less frequently. Only occasional footsteps disturbed the dust. Inside homes, some younger children found brief moments of rest. Others remained beside mothers preparing vegetables, mending clothing, or shaping fresh dough. Learning continued even indoors. One little girl watched carefully as linen thread passed through worn fabric. Another memorized where herbs were stored inside clay containers. One young boy carefully polished simple wooden tools before placing them neatly against a wall. None of these lessons required books. Hands remembered what eyes observed. Generation after generation passed knowledge this way. Sometimes mistakes happened. A clay bowl slipped from nervous fingers. Water spilled across the floor. A loaf burned inside the oven. Children discovered disappointment just as surely as adults did. Usually the lesson came quietly. The broken bowl could not hold grain anymore. The wasted water needed replacing. Another trip to the well became necessary. Actions naturally carried consequences. Rules rarely stood alone. They connected directly to everyday life. Perhaps that was why they settled so deeply into memory. No one needed endless reminders. The village itself reminded everyone. As afternoon slowly approached, shadows shortened beneath bright sunlight. The child returned outdoors carrying a small basket. Its weight felt manageable now. Months earlier it might have seemed heavy. Strength had arrived little by little, almost unnoticed. Growing older often happened this way. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Simply through many ordinary days. The dusty road leading toward the market became busier. Merchants arranged baskets filled with onions, beans, dates, figs, and fresh herbs. Potters displayed simple bowls lined carefully beside water jars. Carpenters rested beneath woven awnings while smoothing wooden handles for farming tools. Children walked respectfully beside parents. Most knew where to stand. Most knew when to remain quiet. These unwritten rules shaped behavior as surely as spoken commands. No one expected perfect obedience every moment. Children still became distracted. A colorful bird might capture someone's attention. A playful puppy might invite laughter. Friends passing nearby sometimes whispered invitations to race toward the river. Yet even these joyful moments carried invisible boundaries. Tasks came first. Play waited until time allowed. Sometimes that time never arrived before sunset. And somehow, this seemed entirely ordinary to those living it. The child noticed another family walking nearby. Their youngest daughter balanced a tiny basket upon her head with remarkable care. She smiled proudly. An older sister quietly adjusted the basket whenever it tilted too far. No words were necessary. Gentle guidance appeared through actions more often than conversation. Across the marketplace, an elderly scribe sat beneath shade with fresh sheets of papyrus rolled neatly beside him. Few children entered his world. Reading and writing demanded years of practice. Families fortunate enough to send a child into such learning understood that different responsibilities awaited there. Even those children found their days filled with discipline. They copied signs patiently. Repeated symbols countless times. Sat quietly for long hours. Their childhood also slowly disappeared beneath expectations, though those expectations looked different from the farmers' or fishermen's. Rules existed everywhere. Only their shapes changed. As the afternoon light softened just a little, the child and father began walking home. Their pace remained slow. There was no reason to rush. Evening would arrive when it chose. The familiar village slowly appeared ahead. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires. Voices drifted softly between houses. Someone laughed. A baby cried. A woman sang quietly while preparing bread. These sounds blended together into the peaceful music of ordinary life. The child carried today's lessons home without fully realizing it. Tomorrow would bring more. And the day after that. Not through great speeches or strict ceremonies, but through small routines repeated beneath the warm Egyptian sky, where every sunrise gently asked a little more than the one before, and where childhood slowly became something quieter, shaped not by a single farewell, but by countless ordinary rules that settled softly into everyday life. The evening settled over the village with the same quiet patience that had welcomed the morning. Heat slowly drifted away from the mud brick walls, leaving behind a gentler warmth that lingered in the air. Long shadows stretched across the narrow paths between homes, softening every sharp edge. The Nile reflected the fading light in long bands of gold that gradually became silver as the sun disappeared beyond the western horizon. The day's work had ended, though the rhythm of life had not. No one simply stopped. There were still baskets to empty. Tools needed to be cleaned before dust hardened upon their wooden handles. Water jars had to be filled for the coming morning. Animals required one last careful look before darkness settled across the fields. The child helped carry a small bundle of reeds from the edge of the irrigation canal back toward home. The reeds felt lighter than they once had. Hands that had seemed so small only a few seasons before had grown stronger through countless ordinary days. The work itself had shaped them. Small scratches marked the fingers. The skin on the palms had become firmer. Even without noticing, the body slowly changed to meet the demands placed upon it. No one spoke of these changes as something remarkable. They were simply expected. A cool breeze wandered through the village. It carried the smell of river water mixed with fresh bread and smoke from cooking fires. Somewhere nearby, lentils simmered inside a clay pot. Another family roasted onions over glowing coals. The gentle fragrance drifted through open doorways, making every home seem connected to the next. The child paused for a moment beside the family doorway. Inside, the mother knelt beside the oven, gently turning flat rounds of dough with practiced hands. The soft light from a small oil lamp danced across the walls, making familiar objects seem almost alive. Clay jars cast long shadows. A woven basket rested beneath a low wooden shelf. Bundles of dried herbs hung quietly overhead. Nothing inside the room was unnecessary. Everything had a purpose. Children noticed this long before they understood it. A broken tool was repaired. A worn piece of cloth became patches for another garment. Old rope found new life securing baskets or tying bundles of reeds. Nothing useful disappeared while it could still serve another day. The child placed the reeds beside the doorway exactly where they belonged. No one had needed to say where. The place had become familiar through repetition. That was how many rules entered life. Not as commands repeated every hour, but as habits gently practiced until they felt as natural as breathing. The evening meal was simple. Fresh bread rested beside bowls of beans and onions. A few dates added sweetness. Cool water filled small cups shaped from fired clay. Sometimes there was fish from the Nile. Sometimes vegetables gathered from nearby gardens. Rich feasts belonged mostly to festivals or households far wealthier than this one. Ordinary families ate ordinary food. Yet there was comfort in its familiarity. The child sat quietly beside parents and younger brothers. Conversation came slowly. The father spoke about tomorrow's work in the fields. The mother mentioned grain that would soon need grinding. An older grandmother reminded everyone that another family nearby would need help repairing part of their roof after recent winds had loosened several bricks. Helping neighbors was rarely considered a choice. It was another quiet rule. One season a family might receive help. Another season they would give it. The village survived because hands often worked together. Children watched these exchanges carefully. Without realizing it, they learned that belonging meant contributing. No lesson was written upon papyrus. No formal teacher explained the idea. The pattern itself became the lesson. After the meal, the youngest children enjoyed a few precious moments of freedom. A small group gathered outside beneath the fading sky. One child rolled a smooth stone across the packed earth while another tried to stop it with bare feet. Two little sisters braided each other's hair while laughing softly. A pair of boys balanced reeds across shallow irrigation ditches, pretending they were narrow bridges over deep water. The games were quiet, simple, made from whatever surrounded them. No carved toys filled large baskets. No elaborate playrooms waited inside homes. The land itself provided almost everything. Stones, reeds, mud, water, palm leaves, a carefully folded scrap of linen. A stick became a shepherd's staff. A bundle of reeds became a tiny fishing boat. The imagination asked very little from the world around it. Yet even these peaceful moments remained short. Soon one mother called her daughter to help wash bowls. Another father asked his son to gather loose firewood before darkness became complete. One child carried water. Another swept the courtyard. The little games faded quietly into evening responsibilities. No one complained very loudly. This was simply how each day unfolded. Little by little, the space reserved only for childhood became smaller. Not because adults wished to steal joy, but because every pair of hands mattered. As the years passed, expectations grew almost unnoticed. A 6-year-old might only carry kindling. An 8-year-old could guide goats toward grazing land. A 10-year-old learned how to repair simple fences. An older child might spend long hours beside a parent shaping bricks beneath the heavy sun. Each new responsibility arrived gently. No single task seemed overwhelming. Together they slowly transformed daily life. It happened so gradually that few people paused to wonder exactly when childhood had begun slipping quietly into adulthood. The moon rose above the eastern horizon. Its pale light reflected softly across the Nile. Fishermen still worked upon the calm water. Their narrow boats drifted almost silently between tall reeds. Nets disappeared beneath the gentle current before rising again with patient hands. Water touched the sides of the boats with a soft rhythmic sound that had echoed across the river for countless generations. One young fisherman worked beside his father. Only a few years earlier he had remained safely on shore. At first he simply watched. Later he learned how to untangle ropes. Then how to fold nets. Eventually he learned where fish gathered during different seasons. Now he stood confidently near the front of the boat, reading the quiet movements of the river almost as well as the older man beside him. Knowledge entered slowly. Responsibility followed naturally. Neither arrived overnight. Far from the river, another child sat beside an elderly grandmother. The old woman carefully twisted flax fibers into thread while telling gentle stories about ancestors whose names had nearly been forgotten. Her voice remained calm, never hurried. She spoke of seasons when the Nile rose especially high. Of years when fields produced abundant grain. Of difficult harvests overcome through patience and shared labor. The stories rarely celebrated famous rulers. Instead they honored ordinary people. A woman remembered for baking bread for hungry neighbors. A farmer known for repairing broken irrigation channels. A potter whose careful hands shaped jars that lasted decades. To the grandmother, these lives deserved remembering. The child listened quietly. Not every lesson came through work. Some arrived through memory. Some through silence. Some through simply sitting beside someone who had lived long enough to understand that every ordinary day eventually became history. The stars brightened overhead. The village gradually grew quieter. Doors closed gently. Cooking fires became glowing embers. Animals settled into peaceful sleep. Only the occasional bark of a distant dog interrupted the stillness. Inside the home, the family prepared for rest. Reed mats were spread across the floor. Folded linen cloths became simple pillows. The oil lamp burned softly, its small flame dancing whenever a breeze wandered through the doorway. The child lay awake for a few moments. The body felt pleasantly tired. Arms ached slightly from carrying reeds. Feet still remembered the rough feeling of dusty paths. The smell of baked bread lingered in the room. Outside, someone walked slowly past the house. Sandals brushed softly against packed earth. Then came silence once more. In these quiet hours, there was finally no work to complete. No baskets to carry. No fields to tend. No water jars waiting. Only rest. Even so, Tomorrow already waited beyond the darkness. Morning would return. The rooster would call again. The grinding stone would begin its familiar rhythm before sunrise. The cycle never truly stopped. For children, this constant rhythm shaped far more than daily schedules. It shaped how they understood themselves. A child learned worth through usefulness. Pride often came from completing a task well. An older sister smiled quietly after baking bread without burning it. A young brother stood a little taller after successfully guiding stubborn goats home before sunset. These were small victories. Yet they mattered deeply. Praise was often gentle. Sometimes it came only through a simple nod. Sometimes through being trusted with a slightly larger responsibility the next day. Trust itself became a reward. As years passed, trust replaced play little by little. No one announced the exchange. It simply happened. At the edge of the village stood a workshop where builders shaped limestone blocks for nearby construction. During daylight the sound of copper chisels striking stone echoed steadily through the air. Now, beneath moonlight, everything rested. Large unfinished blocks waited exactly where workers had left them. Stone dust covered the ground like pale sand. Wooden sledges leaned against the walls. Ropes hung neatly from pegs. Tomorrow they would all come alive once again. Among those workers were boys barely old enough to remember when they had first entered the workshop. At first they swept the floor. Then they carried water. Later they sharpened tools. Eventually they learned how to smooth stone with patient, careful movements. Each year added another skill. Each skill carried another expectation. No one asked whether childhood should last longer. Life itself offered little room for such questions. Nearby, a young apprentice scribe sat beneath a lamp reviewing symbols drawn earlier that afternoon. His fingers traced familiar signs across smooth papyrus. Mistakes had been carefully corrected by his teacher. Tomorrow there would be more. Writing demanded discipline every bit as steady as farming or fishing. Hours passed quietly beneath watchful eyes. Straight lines. Balanced shapes. Patient repetition. Even children whose futures looked different discovered that rules gently surrounded every path. The village itself seemed built upon quiet order. The baker rose before dawn. The potter shaped clay before midday heat became too strong. The fishermen watched the river. The farmers watched the sky. The children watched everyone. That careful watching slowly became imitation. Imitation became habit. Habit became identity. Years passed this way. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Only through countless peaceful mornings and evenings linked together like woven reeds in a basket. One season followed another. The Nile rose. The Nile slowly fell. Fields changed from green to golden. Fresh grain filled storage jars. Then planting began once more. Children hardly noticed how much they changed between one flood and the next. One year a child needed help lifting a water jar. A few floods later, that same child carried two with steady hands. One year small feet struggled to keep pace beside adults. Later those same footsteps matched them without effort. The body remembered every season. So did the heart. There were moments when childhood still returned. A sudden splash of cool river water on a hot afternoon. A flock of birds rising unexpectedly from tall reeds. The delight of finding ripe figs before anyone else. Laughter shared while shaping wet mud into playful little animals before the clay was needed for more practical work. These moments never vanished completely. They simply became shorter. Responsibility always waited nearby. Like the slow shadow of evening stretching across the village, it quietly reached a little farther each passing year. The ancient world did not separate childhood from the rest of life as sharply as many later generations would imagine. Growing older was less like crossing a doorway and more like walking along a familiar path where each step felt almost the same as the last. Only after traveling a great distance could someone look back and realize how far they had come. The child sleeping peacefully upon the reed mat could not yet see that path. Tomorrow would seem much like today. The morning after that would seem familiar as well. Yet hidden within those ordinary days were hundreds of tiny lessons, thousands of quiet expectations, and countless unwritten rules that gently shaped every thought, every movement, and every dream. Outside, the Nile continued its endless journey beneath the moon. Its waters flowed without hurry. The reeds whispered softly whenever the night breeze touched them. Stars reflected upon the calm surface before drifting apart with the slow current. The river had watched generations of children awaken, grow, work, laugh, and quietly leave childhood behind. It would watch many more. And before another sunrise arrived, while the village rested beneath the peaceful Egyptian sky, those silent waters continued moving onward with the same gentle patience they had carried since the beginning of memory. Night slowly reached its deepest hour. The last voices faded from the village until only the smallest sounds remained. A gentle breeze brushed against the tops of date palms. Somewhere beyond the nearest homes, a donkey shifted quietly in its shelter before settling once again. The Nile moved through the darkness with the same calm rhythm it had followed for thousands of years, carrying cool water between banks lined with reeds that swayed almost without a sound. Inside the small mud brick house, the family slept closely together. The child rested on a woven reed mat, wrapped in a simple linen cloth that had become softer through many years of careful use. The warmth gathered during the day had mostly left the walls now, and the coolness of the night settled gently across the room. For a little while, there were no expectations. No baskets to lift. No paths to walk. No tools waiting by the doorway. Only slow breathing. Only quiet dreams. The peaceful darkness belonged equally to everyone. The father rested after long hours in the fields. The mother slept after grinding grain, baking bread, carrying water, preparing food, repairing clothing, and caring for every member of the household. Even the oldest grandmother, whose hands had worked for more seasons than anyone could easily count, finally allowed herself a few hours of stillness. Night was the only time when work asked nothing more. Yet before long, the first hint of another morning quietly appeared. It arrived so gently that almost no one noticed. The eastern sky became slightly lighter than the west. The stars nearest the horizon slowly disappeared. A cool wind crossed the open fields, carrying the fresh scent of damp earth from irrigation canals that still held yesterday's water. The village had reached another beginning. The mother opened her eyes. She did not need anyone to wake her. Her body had learned this rhythm many years before she could remember. She rose carefully, making almost no sound, so the youngest children could sleep a little longer. Bare feet crossed the smooth floor. The familiar grinding stone waited patiently where it always rested. She poured a small measure of grain into its shallow surface. Then came the first quiet scraping sound of another day. Stone against stone. Slow. Steady. Patient. It was not loud enough to disturb the peace of the morning. Instead, it became part of the morning itself. Throughout villages across ancient Egypt, countless women repeated this same movement before sunrise. The sound blended with distant footsteps, quiet birdsong, and the soft whisper of the river until it became one voice shared by the whole land. The child stirred. Eyes opened slowly. There was no surprise. Morning always came. The body already understood what the day would ask. Outside, the air felt wonderfully cool for a few precious moments. The child stepped into the courtyard carrying a small clay cup. Above, the sky glowed with pale colors that seemed almost too gentle to notice unless someone stopped and watched them carefully. An elderly neighbor was already sweeping dust from the front of her home. Every morning she performed the same quiet task. Dust always returned. She always swept again. The work was never truly finished. Many parts of life felt this way. Bread was baked each day because yesterday's loaf had already been eaten. Water was carried because empty jars could not fill themselves. Fields required attention because plants continued growing whether anyone felt tired or not. Children slowly came to understand that much of life consisted of caring for ordinary things over and over again. At first this repetition seemed endless. Later it became comforting. Routine brought a feeling of order. Every familiar task quietly promised that another peaceful day had begun. The father emerged carrying a wooden yoke across one shoulder. Its surface had become polished by years of steady use. He inspected it briefly before nodding with quiet satisfaction. Nothing appeared broken. It would serve another day. The child noticed every movement. Adults rarely announced their lessons. Instead, they demonstrated them. Care for your tools. Store them properly. Repair them before they fail. Waste as little as possible. The child absorbed these ideas simply by watching. Observation often taught more deeply than long conversations. Soon several families walked together toward the fields. Children moved among them in small groups. Some carried baskets woven from reeds. Others balanced clay jars upon their hips. One older girl gently guided her younger brother away from a patch of loose stones. She did not scold him. She simply reached for his hand. Responsibility often appeared this quietly. Older children watched younger ones almost without thinking. They had once been watched in the same way. The path leading away from the village crossed firm earth marked by countless footprints. Every day added new tracks. Every wind slowly erased them. Only the road remained. The child enjoyed these walks. Not because they were free from work, but because the land itself always seemed peaceful before the heat arrived. Birds searched among reeds beside the canals. Small fish disturbed the still water with tiny ripples. White flowers opened toward the growing light. Far away, the broad Nile reflected the sky so perfectly that the boundary between water and air almost disappeared. The beauty of the morning belonged to everyone. Rich or poor. Farmer or scribe. Builder or fisherman. No one owned the sunrise. The fields gradually filled with quiet movement. Workers spread across rows of growing crops. Some checked irrigation channels. Others removed weeds by hand. Children joined wherever they were needed. One young boy carefully chased birds away from tender plants without harming them. A little girl gathered fallen vegetables into a basket almost half her size. Two brothers helped their father repair a narrow bank where water had begun wearing away the soil. Each task appeared small. Together they protected the harvest that would feed many families. The child knelt beside a narrow irrigation channel. Cool water slipped slowly past, reflecting patches of blue sky between waving reeds. For just a moment, the child dipped tired fingers into the current. The coolness felt wonderful. The water moved around each finger before continuing downstream as though nothing had interrupted its journey. The father smiled gently. There is time to enjoy the river, his expression seemed to say, but there is also work waiting. No harsh words were needed. The child stood and returned to the task. This balance appeared again and again throughout ancient life. Pleasure was welcome. Duty simply came first. As the sun climbed higher, warmth settled over the fields. Morning freshness slowly disappeared. The smell of moist earth gave way to the dry scent of warming soil. Tiny insects hummed among growing plants. Sweat gathered across foreheads. Sandals became dusty. The child wiped a hand across the face before continuing. Nearby, an older farmer paused beneath the shade of a sycamore fig tree. His grandson sat beside him sharing a small piece of fresh bread. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence itself felt peaceful. Finally, the old man pointed toward the fields. He remembered working there as a boy. His own grandfather had once stood almost exactly where he now rested. Generations seemed to overlap in places like this. The same paths. The same river. The same morning light. Only the faces slowly changed. The grandson listened carefully. He had heard many of these stories before. Even so, he never interrupted. Respect for age was not simply encouraged. It surrounded daily life. Older voices carried the weight of long experience. Children learned patience by listening. They learned memory by repeating family stories. In time, they would tell the same stories to children yet unborn. The sun continued rising. Its light became stronger. Workers adjusted cloth around their heads to soften the heat. Water jars were passed carefully from one pair of hands to another. No one drank carelessly. Every drop mattered. The child noticed how adults shared without counting. One sip for a neighbor. Another for a younger worker. The jar moved quietly through many hands before returning to the shade. Kindness often appeared in simple actions rather than grand gestures. No one expected applause. Helping another person simply belonged to the rhythm of village life. By late morning, a merchant arrived with a small donkey carrying woven baskets filled with salt, dried fish, and carefully folded linen. He greeted the workers with calm familiarity. Many families had known him for years. The children watched him unpack each basket. They admired the careful order of his work. Nothing was placed carelessly. Every item had its proper place. Even trade became another lesson. Be honest with your measurements. Protect your goods from dust. Remember every agreement. Treat familiar faces with respect. The merchant never gathered the children around to explain these rules. He lived them. Children quietly noticed. Farther along the road, a young apprentice accompanied an experienced stonemason returning from a nearby building site. The older man walked slowly because his shoulders carried many years of labor. The apprentice carried several copper tools wrapped inside linen. Not long ago, those tools would have seemed too valuable for him to hold. Now they had been placed in his care. Trust had grown little by little. It had not arrived because of age alone. It had been earned through many ordinary mornings just like this one. The apprentice understood something important without saying it aloud. Responsibility was not only about working harder. It was about becoming dependable. Others began relying upon you. They expected careful hands, steady attention, quiet honesty. These qualities were built over time, just as a strong wall was built one brick after another. The child watched the two builders disappear along the dusty path and wondered, if only for a passing moment, what kind of work the future might bring. Perhaps farming. Perhaps fishing. Perhaps shaping clay or carving wood. The exact path remained unknown. But one thing already seemed certain. Whatever life became, it would be filled with quiet routines learned one peaceful day after another beneath the warm Egyptian sun. The morning gradually gave itself to the middle of the day. The gentle coolness that had welcomed the first light disappeared beneath the broad Egyptian sky. Sunlight rested heavily upon the fields until every stone seemed to hold its own warmth. The mud brick homes in the village shimmered softly in the distance, their pale walls reflecting the bright light back into the air. The child worked beside the family without counting the hours. There was no clock. No bell marking the passing of time. The changing sky became the measure of the day. The movement of shadows across the ground quietly told everyone when morning was ending and when afternoon would begin. Life moved according to nature rather than numbers. Children learned this almost before they learned their own names. A father might simply say that work would continue until the shadow of the sycamore tree reached a certain stone. A mother knew when bread should enter the oven by the warmth already filling the courtyard. A fisherman watched the river instead of a clock. A shepherd watched the sun instead of a calendar. The child slowly came to understand these quiet signs. No one hurried the lesson. The land itself offered patient instruction. Nearby, another family harvested bundles of flax. Their careful hands pulled each plant from the earth before laying the long stems neatly together. The oldest daughter worked beside her mother. She had once wandered through these same fields collecting flowers and chasing butterflies that drifted above the irrigation canals. Now her hands moved with calm confidence. She gathered the flax in even bundles. She checked each handful before tying it. Her mother rarely needed to correct her. The work had become familiar. No one had announced the day when play slowly gave way to skill. The change had arrived through hundreds of ordinary mornings. Each small task quietly prepared her for the next. The child watched for a moment before returning to the family row of crops. Watching others was part of learning. Every village became a living classroom. Every neighbor carried knowledge gathered over many seasons. A potter knew the feel of perfect clay. A carpenter understood the grain hidden inside each piece of wood. A fisherman recognized subtle movements upon the river long before anyone else noticed them. Children observed these people constantly. Sometimes they asked questions. Often they simply watched in respectful silence. Observation built memory. Memory slowly became experience. A light breeze crossed the fields. For a few precious moments the air felt cooler. Tall papyrus plants along the river bent gently together, creating a soft whisper that drifted across the water. Dragonflies hovered above the canals. White birds stood perfectly still near the riverbank, waiting patiently for small fish to swim close enough. The child paused again. Nature always seemed busy without appearing hurried. Perhaps people had learned something from the river itself. The Nile never rushed. Yet year after year it shaped the entire land. Its patient flooding left behind rich soil. Its calm current carried boats filled with grain, stone, wood, and woven cloth. Its steady rhythm quietly supported every village. Children grew beside this river. Without realizing it, many of its qualities became their own. Patience, steadiness, endurance. The father knelt to repair a narrow section of the irrigation bank where water had begun escaping into a shallow depression. The child immediately joined him. No words were exchanged. The task belonged to both of them now. Together they pressed damp earth into place. Hands became covered with cool mud. The fresh soil carried a rich scent unlike the dry dust covering the nearby paths. Water slowed. The small opening disappeared. The channel once again guided the precious flow toward growing crops. The father looked quietly at the repaired bank. Then he gave the smallest nod. It lasted only a moment. Yet the child felt a warm sense of pride. Praise in ancient Egypt often arrived this way. Not through long speeches. Not through loud celebration. A quiet nod. A calm smile. Being trusted with tomorrow's work. These gentle signs carried great meaning. Children learned to value steady approval more than dramatic rewards. The afternoon continued. The heat deepened. Workers gradually sought moments of shade whenever possible. A cluster of palm trees near the edge of the field became a welcome resting place. Families gathered beneath their broad leaves carrying simple meals prepared before sunrise. Fresh bread rested upon folded linen cloth. Onions, beans, cucumbers, and a handful of dates were shared among tired hands. Clay jars kept cool water surprisingly fresh despite the warmth surrounding them. The child sat beside the grandmother. She tore a small piece of bread and handed it over with a gentle smile. Neither spoke immediately. The breeze moved softly through the palms above them. Dry leaves rustled together like distant whispers. Finally, the grandmother looked toward the fields. "When I was small," she said quietly, "these trees were already old." The child looked upward. Their trunks were thick. Their roots disappeared deep into the earth. It seemed impossible to imagine them any younger. The grandmother smiled again. "Many people believe only kings leave something behind," she continued softly. "But these trees remember ordinary families just as well." The child listened carefully. The old woman rarely wasted words. "When I carried water as a little girl, I rested beneath this same shade." She brushed a little dust from her hands. "My mother rested here too." The child looked again at the wide leaves moving gently above. Suddenly the trees seemed different. Not simply plants. They had quietly watched generations grow. Children had become parents beneath these branches. Parents had become grandparents. Grandparents had slowly disappeared while new children arrived to play among the roots. The trees had remained. The village itself held countless silent memories. A worn stone beside the well had been touched by thousands of hands. The path toward the river carried footprints too many to imagine. The oven inside the family home had baked bread through seasons of abundance and seasons of hardship alike. Children rarely noticed such things at first. Age gradually taught them to see the quiet history surrounding everyday places. After the short meal, everyone returned to work. No one complained. Rest itself felt more satisfying because it remained brief. The child picked up the familiar basket once again. Its woven reeds had darkened with age. One handle had been repaired several times. Even the basket carried its own story. Objects remained with families for many years. They were cared for carefully because replacing them required precious time and labor. The child remembered helping repair the basket during the previous winter. The father had shown how new reeds could strengthen old ones. Nothing useful was abandoned too quickly. That lesson reached far beyond baskets. Relationships, skills, traditions. Everything worth keeping required patient care. As the afternoon slowly drifted onward, a small group of boys led several donkeys along the dusty road. The animals carried sacks filled with harvested grain. Each boy knew the personality of the donkey walking beside him. One animal needed gentle encouragement. Another preferred steady silence. A third often wandered toward patches of fresh grass whenever given the chance. The boys guided them calmly. No shouting echoed across the road. The donkeys responded best to quiet familiarity. Children learned patience from animals as much as from people. A frightened goat required calm hands. An anxious donkey sensed loud voices. Fishermen understood that sudden movements frightened fish. Builders knew that rushing often damaged carefully shaped stone. Every craft rewarded steadiness. Perhaps that was why village life itself developed such a peaceful rhythm. Not because work was easy. Because calm attention usually produced better results than haste. Farther along the riverbank, a young apprentice sat beside an elderly fisherman repairing a torn net. The old man did not mend it alone. Instead, he placed the cord into the apprentice's hands. Slowly. Patiently. One knot at a time. The younger hands copied each movement. Sometimes they made mistakes. The older fisherman quietly untied the knot. Then they tried again. Neither seemed frustrated. Both understood that skill arrived slowly. The child passing nearby paused just long enough to watch. It seemed almost magical how tangled threads gradually became a strong fishing net once more. The old fisherman noticed the curious eyes. He smiled warmly. Without speaking, he handed the child a short piece of cord. The child tried making the same knot. It slipped loose almost immediately. The fisherman gently took the cord back. His weathered fingers repeated the movement. Slowly. Carefully. Again the child tried. This time the knot held. The fisherman smiled once more before returning to his own work. No grand lesson had been spoken. Still, the child carried something valuable away from that quiet moment. Learning required patience. Patience could not be hurried. As the sun began its slow journey toward the western horizon, the brightness softened almost imperceptibly. Long shadows started stretching across the fields once more. Birdsong slowly returned after the stillness of the hottest hours. A pair of ibises glided low across the water before disappearing among tall reeds. The child noticed how different the world looked now compared with early morning. The same fields. The same river. The same homes. Yet everything seemed quieter. The day's labor had settled gently into tired muscles. Hands felt heavier. Feet moved more slowly along the dusty paths. Even the wind seemed softer. The father gathered the family's tools. Each one was counted. Each one carefully cleaned before being wrapped in linen. The child helped without needing instructions. There had been a time when every step required reminding. Now the routine lived comfortably in memory. The father glanced at the child with quiet satisfaction. Another small responsibility had become a habit. Another unwritten rule had quietly taken root. No ceremony marked the moment. No celebration announced it. Like the river wearing smooth the rough edges of stone, daily life shaped childhood little by little, asking only a little more with each passing season, until the child no longer noticed where simple play had ended and dependable responsibility had gently begun beneath the endless, peaceful sky of ancient Egypt. The path home felt different from the path that had welcomed the morning. The same dusty road stretched between the fields and the village, yet the evening carried another kind of quiet. The brightness of midday had softened into warm golden light. Shadows from palm trees reached farther across the ground, touching the edges of irrigation canals where dragonflies schemed gently above the slow-moving water. The child walked beside the father without speaking. Neither felt the need to fill the silence. Their footsteps matched one another almost naturally now. When the child had been much younger, those same feet had hurried to keep pace. Small legs often struggled across uneven ground, and a helping hand was offered more than once. Now the distance seemed shorter. The walking felt easier. The child had grown without noticing. Perhaps growing always happened that way. One ordinary day resembled another so closely that change remained invisible until someone paused to remember how life had once been. Ahead, the village slowly came into view. Thin streams of smoke rose from cooking fires, twisting lazily into the calm evening air. Women stood beside clay ovens, shaping fresh rounds of bread with practiced hands. The warm scent drifted through narrow lanes, mixing with the smell of dry reeds, warm earth, and the faint freshness carried from the Nile. The familiar smells welcomed every family home. No matter how long the day had been, they promised comfort. Children recognized these scents almost before they could speak. Bread meant evening. Smoke meant warmth. The quiet voices of neighbors meant another day had passed safely. The child entered the courtyard carrying a small basket filled with onions gathered from the edge of the family's field. The basket was placed beside several clay jars without anyone offering instructions. The proper place had been learned long ago. Memory had quietly replaced reminders. Nearby, the mother poured grain into a shallow basket, carefully removing tiny stones left behind after harvesting. Her hands moved with remarkable patience. Each grain mattered. Each careless mistake meant less food waiting for another day. The child sat beside her. Without asking, small hands joined the careful work. Mother and child worked together in comfortable silence. Only the soft clicking of grain against woven reeds could be heard. For a long while, neither spoke. Conversation was not always necessary. Many families spent countless peaceful moments simply working side by side. Love often appeared through shared labor rather than spoken words. As the evening continued, younger children wandered into the courtyard after finishing their own small responsibilities. One little boy proudly carried a bundle of dry twigs almost as tall as himself. His older sister smiled quietly before arranging them neatly beside the cooking fire. She did not laugh at the uneven bundle. Instead, she gently tightened the rope holding the sticks together. The little boy watched carefully. Next time, he would remember. Teaching often looked exactly like this. Patient. Gentle. Almost unnoticed. Across the narrow lane, an elderly man repaired a broken stool outside his home. Two children sat nearby watching every movement. The old craftsman selected a smooth wooden peg before carefully fitting it into the cracked leg. He tested the strength with both hands. Then he sanded the rough edge using a piece of coarse stone. The children leaned forward with quiet interest. The old man smiled. He understood they were learning. Not because he had invited them. Simply because they had been watching. Observation filled every corner of village life. A child passing a baker learned how dough changed beneath warm hands. Another watching fisherman discovered how wet nets should be folded before sunrise. A walk through the marketplace became a lesson in measuring grain, weighing goods, and greeting neighbors respectfully. Even silence carried instruction. The village itself gently educated every child living within its walls. As darkness approached, families gathered water before the well became too crowded. The child lifted a clay jar carefully. It still required both hands. The water inside shifted gently with every step. Long ago, carrying such a jar had seemed impossible. Now it demanded only steady attention. An older woman standing nearby noticed the careful balance. She smiled warmly. "You carry it well now," she said softly. The child looked down at the jar. Only then came the realization that it no longer felt unusually heavy. Strength had arrived through repetition. There had never been one special day when the body suddenly became stronger. Instead, Every ordinary morning had quietly added something. Every basket carried. Every walk completed. Every bundle lifted. Small efforts joined together until they became lasting ability. The same quiet change happened inside the mind. At first, children remembered only one or two simple instructions. Later they carried entire routines without forgetting a single step. Feed the animals. Cover the grain. Sweep the courtyard. Return the tools. Close the storage jars. Check the cooking fire. Bring water before sunset. These tasks slowly settled into memory. Eventually they became part of who the child was. Responsibility no longer felt like something added from outside. It became something carried naturally within. As twilight spread across the village, workers returned from many different places. The fishermen came from the Nile with damp nets resting over tired shoulders. Stonecutters arrived with fine white dust still clinging to their linen clothing. Potters brushed dried clay from their hands before entering their homes. Scribes rolled fresh sheets of papyrus carefully to protect them from moisture during the night. Each person returned carrying signs of the day's labor. Children noticed these details. A builder's hands looked different from a fisherman's. A shepherd walked differently from a merchant. Each kind of work slowly shaped the body performing it. The child wondered about this while watching neighbors pass. What would the future leave upon these small hands? Would they become rough from rope? Smooth from papyrus? Strong from farming? Dusty from shaping stone? No answer arrived. There was no need to hurry toward tomorrow. Tomorrow would come on its own. The evening meal began as the first stars appeared overhead. The family gathered once more around simple dishes placed upon a woven mat. Fresh bread. Beans cooked slowly with herbs. A few dates. Slices of cucumber cooled in water. Sometimes a little fish caught earlier that afternoon. Nothing seemed extravagant. Yet every meal carried the quiet satisfaction of shared effort. Nearly every person sitting together had helped bring the food to the table in some way. The youngest might have gathered kindling. The oldest might have ground grain before dawn. Each contribution mattered. While eating, the grandmother began speaking about a flood she remembered from many years before. She described how the Nile had risen unusually high. The fields had remained underwater longer than expected. For a while, many families worried about the coming harvest. The child listened carefully. But everyone helped one another, she said. The builders repaired damaged walls. The fishermen shared extra food. The farmers worked together until every field was ready again. She paused. The river teaches patience. No one interrupted. The old woman looked toward the doorway where the moonlight had begun reaching across the floor. It also teaches that no season lasts forever. The child thought quietly about those words. Perhaps difficult days ended. Perhaps easy days also passed. The river never remained exactly the same. Neither did people. Neither did childhood. After the meal, the family stepped outside into the cooling night. The air felt pleasant once again after the long heat of the afternoon. Neighbors sat outside their homes speaking softly. Children, finally free from the day's responsibilities, enjoyed a few peaceful moments together beneath the stars. They played simple games with pebbles arranged in circles drawn upon the earth. One little girl carefully floated a tiny reed boat in a shallow canal beside the road. A younger boy followed the slow current until the boat gently disappeared beneath overhanging reeds. Their laughter remained soft. No one wished to disturb the peaceful evening. The child joined them for a little while. For these few moments, Work seemed far away. The stars above looked countless. The moon reflected upon the quiet Nile. A cool breeze stirred the tops of the palms. The world felt gentle again. Yet even during play, small reminders quietly appeared. One child stopped to help a younger brother who had stumbled. Another gathered scattered pebbles before returning home. A third remembered to carry the little reed boat back instead of leaving it behind. Responsibility had already become part of play itself. The rules no longer felt separate from life. They had become woven into ordinary habits. As the evening grew later, mothers began calling softly from nearby doorways. Not with impatience. Simply with familiarity. It was time to sleep. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise. The children answered without protest. Their bodies already felt pleasantly tired. Inside the family home, the oil lamp burned with a steady golden flame. Its light touched the rough mud brick walls, the clay jars resting quietly in their places, the woven baskets hanging from wooden pegs, and the sandals waiting neatly beside the doorway. Everything stood ready for another ordinary day. The child spread the familiar reed mat across the floor. Nearby, the father carefully inspected a wooden hoe before placing it against the wall. The mother covered the remaining bread with linen to keep it fresh until morning. The grandmother quietly folded a worn shawl she had mended earlier that evening. No movement was hurried. Every action carried the calm rhythm of long practice. Outside, the village gradually fell silent once again. The sounds of conversation faded one home at a time. Cooking fires became glowing embers. Dogs curled beside doorways. Goats settled into quiet sleep. The Nile continued flowing beneath the stars, just as it always had. The child closed tired eyes. The day's lessons drifted gently through memory. Not as formal teachings. Not as strict commands. But as ordinary moments. A basket placed in its proper corner. A water jar carried without spilling. A quiet nod from the father. A story shared by the grandmother beneath the shade of old palms. A fisherman patiently tying the same knot again and again. A repaired basket lasting another season. None of these moments seemed important by themselves. Together, they slowly shaped a life. And while the child slept peacefully beneath the calm Egyptian night, another small piece of childhood quietly settled behind the gentle, familiar rhythm of daily rules so gradually that no one, not even the child, could have said exactly when the change had begun. Before the first bird called across the fields, the Nile was already awake. Its waters never truly rested. They moved with quiet certainty through the darkness, slipping past clusters of papyrus and smooth stones that had remained in the same places for longer than anyone could remember. Moonlight rested upon the gentle current, breaking into small shimmering patterns whenever a fish disturbed the surface below. The village still slept. Only a few small lamps glowed behind mud brick walls where early risers had quietly begun another familiar morning. The silence carried a comforting weight, as though the whole land had paused for one last peaceful breath before the day's gentle labor began again. The child remained asleep for only a little longer. Dreams came softly. They were not filled with grand adventures or distant places. Instead, they were made of ordinary things. Walking beside the father through green fields. Listening to the grandmother's calm voice beneath the shade of old trees. Watching bread rise slowly near the warm clay oven. Following tiny reed boats drifting along narrow canals. The mind remembered what life offered each day. When the child finally opened sleepy eyes, nothing seemed surprising. Everything rested exactly where it had been the evening before. The clay jars stood beside the wall. The woven baskets hung from their pegs. The folded linen cloth lay neatly beside the reed mat. Even before standing, the child already knew what the morning would ask. That quiet certainty brought comfort rather than worry. Routine had become familiar. Outside, the eastern sky slowly changed from deep blue to pale gray. A faint golden line appeared along the horizon. Palm trees stood in peaceful silence, their long leaves hardly moving in the cool morning air. The mother was already grinding grain. Her hands followed the same careful rhythm they had practiced for many years. Stone moved against stone. Slowly. Evenly. Without haste. The sound drifted gently through the open doorway. To someone visiting the village for the first time, it might have seemed repetitive. To the family, it sounded like home. Every household possessed its own morning music. Some heard grinding stones. Others heard fishermen preparing nets. Builders lifting wooden sledges. Goat herds calling softly to restless animals. The child stepped outside carrying a small broom made from bundled reeds. Without being asked, the courtyard was gently swept. Fine dust gathered into little piles before being carried beyond the doorway. Tomorrow the dust would return. The child already knew this. Still, the sweeping mattered. A clean courtyard welcomed the day. It made walking easier. It kept insects away from stored grain. Even the simplest task held quiet purpose. Across the lane, another child was doing exactly the same thing. Neither waved. Neither spoke. They smiled briefly before continuing their work. There was comfort in knowing that nearly every family greeted the morning in similar ways. The whole village seemed to breathe together. Soon the father emerged carrying 2 empty water jars. Without saying a word, he handed the smaller one to the child. Years earlier, the jar would have remained inside the house. It had been too heavy then. Now it belonged naturally in smaller hands. The child accepted it without hesitation. This was another quiet step. Another responsibility added so gently that it hardly felt new. The path to the well wound between closely built homes. The packed earth had become smooth beneath generations of footsteps. Morning dew had not reached this dry land, yet the cool air made walking pleasant before the heat settled over everything. Women greeted one another softly while waiting their turn. Children stood patiently beside them. No one pushed forward. No one hurried the process. Everyone understood that the well belonged to the whole village. Patience made the morning easier for all. The child watched an elderly woman lower her clay jar with slow, practiced movements. She had likely repeated this action thousands of times. Her hands showed no wasted effort. The rope remained steady. The jar entered the water gently. A moment later it rose again, full and shining. Simple tasks often became beautiful when performed with care. The child lowered the smaller jar. At first the rope slipped a little too quickly. The father quietly placed one hand over the child's. Not to take over. Only to guide. Together they slowed the descent. The jar touched the water without splashing. When it returned full, the father smiled. "Better," he said softly. Only one word. It was enough. The child carried the water home carefully. Each step demanded attention. Too much speed would spill precious water onto the dusty path. Too little confidence would make the journey unnecessarily difficult. Balance had to be found. Perhaps many parts of life worked the same way. As the village awakened fully, gentle sounds filled the air. Goats wandered from their shelters. Donkeys shook their heads, causing simple ropes to sway against wooden posts. Birds gathered upon rooftops before flying toward the river. Cooking fires released thin streams of fragrant smoke into the brightening sky. The scent of baking bread slowly spread from house to house. No family baked exactly the same loaf. Some added herbs gathered near the canals. Others shaped the dough slightly thicker or thinner. Children often recognized their own home's bread simply by its smell. It was another quiet piece of belonging. The child helped place fresh loaves upon a woven cloth to cool. Warm air rose from the bread, carrying the rich smell of grain harvested months before. The mother gently brushed away a little flour from the child's cheek. She smiled but said nothing. Some moments required no words. After breakfast, the father prepared to visit a nearby workshop where several neighbors were repairing farming tools before the busiest part of the growing season. The child walked beside him. The road passed between gardens where onions, beans, and herbs grew in carefully tended rows. Older women knelt among the plants, pulling tiny weeds before they could spread. Even this patient work carried lessons. If small problems were ignored, they became larger ones. Children noticed such things without anyone turning them into formal teachings. The workshop stood beneath a broad awning made from woven reeds. Inside, the air smelled of wood shavings, polished handles, copper, and dry rope. Morning sunlight filtered through the roof in thin golden lines. Tiny specks of dust floated lazily within the light. Several craftsmen were already busy. One sharpened a copper blade using smooth stone and steady hands. Another replaced the cracked handle of a wooden hoe. A third carefully twisted fresh rope from flax fibers. No one worked loudly. Conversation remained gentle. The rhythm of tools filled the workshop more completely than voices. The child stood quietly near the entrance. Watching. Always watching. Observation remained one of the greatest teachers. A carpenter noticed the curious eyes. He held up two pieces of wood. One had grown straight. The other curved gently from years of wind. He placed both upon the bench. "The straight piece looks easier," he said calmly. "But sometimes the curved one is stronger." He ran weathered fingers across the grain. "You must learn to see what the wood wishes to become." The child looked carefully. The lesson seemed to speak about more than wood. The carpenter returned to his work without explaining further. Children in the village often received wisdom this way. A few simple words. Then quiet. Enough space to think. Nearby, another apprentice sorted small copper nails into clay bowls. Not one was thrown carelessly. Each was counted. Each had value. Copper required effort to produce. Nothing useful was wasted. The apprentice had once been a child carrying water and sweeping floors. Now he had earned greater trust. Watching him, the younger child imagined how many mornings had slowly built that trust. Not one. Not 10. Hundreds. Perhaps even thousands. Responsibility grew like a tree beside the river. Too slowly to notice from one day to the next. Yet after many seasons, its shade stretched wide enough for others to rest beneath. As midday approached, more villagers arrived seeking repairs. A shepherd brought a broken crook. A fisherman carried a cracked paddle. A farmer needed a loose blade secured once more. Each person waited patiently. No one expected immediate attention. Good work required time. Children observed this as carefully as everything else. Hurrying often created more work later. Patience protected both tools and people. The child sat beside the doorway, tracing gentle patterns in the dust with one finger while listening to the quiet conversations drifting through the workshop. They were not dramatic stories. No one spoke of distant kingdoms or great victories. Instead they discussed the coming harvest, the height of the river, the condition of nearby fields, whether an elderly neighbor might need help repairing his roof before the next strong wind. These ordinary conversations held the village together. They reminded everyone that life was shared. No family stood entirely alone. The child listened without fully understanding every detail. Still, those calm voices settled gently into memory. Years later, similar conversations would come naturally. The child would one day speak in the same thoughtful tone, offering advice to someone younger who listened with patient curiosity. Without anyone noticing the exact moment, another layer of childhood quietly folded itself into the peaceful rhythm of the village, carried not by sudden commands or strict ceremonies, but by countless ordinary mornings filled with careful hands, familiar faces, steady work, and the gentle wisdom that passed from one generation to the next as faithfully as the Nile flowed beneath the warm Egyptian sky. The workshop gradually became quieter as the brightest hours of the afternoon settled over the village. Outside, the sunlight rested heavily upon the dusty road. The warm air shimmered above the packed earth, making distant palm trees appear to move gently even when they stood perfectly still. The Nile continued its patient journey beyond the fields, reflecting the clear sky in long ribbons of pale blue and gold. Inside the shaded workshop, the child remained seated near the doorway. There was always something to notice. A carpenter tested the smoothness of a newly shaped handle by closing his eyes and running careful fingers along the polished wood. He trusted touch as much as sight. A rope maker slowly twisted long flax fibers together. His hands never hurried. Each movement matched the last with quiet precision until dozens of thin strands became one strong cord. An elderly metal worker held a small copper blade toward the light, turning it gently to inspect its edge. He smiled with quiet satisfaction before placing it beside several finished tools. To the child, these tasks seemed almost peaceful. Nothing appeared rushed. No loud commands echoed through the room. Each person understood the work waiting before them. Perhaps this was another lesson. When everyone knew their place within the rhythm of the day, silence itself became comfortable. The father greeted several neighbors before kneeling beside a broken plow. Its wooden beam had cracked after many seasons of faithful service. The damage was not surprising. Everything made by human hands eventually showed signs of time. The child watched closely. The father did not immediately begin the repair. First, he examined every part. He turned the wood over slowly. He pressed gently against the crack. He looked for smaller weaknesses hidden beneath the surface. Only after understanding the problem did he begin working. The child remembered this without anyone asking. Look carefully before acting. Patience often saved more time than haste. Outside, a pair of younger children walked past carrying woven baskets filled with figs gathered from nearby trees. Their steps were slow because the baskets were almost too large for them. One child stumbled slightly when a stone rolled beneath a sandal. The other immediately reached over to steady the basket before any fruit could spill. Neither laughed. Neither seemed annoyed. Helping one another had become almost automatic. Many responsibilities in the village belonged not to one person but to everyone together. As the afternoon drifted onward, a gentle breeze finally reached the workshop. It carried with it the scent of the river. Cool water. Fresh reeds. Moist earth. For a brief moment the warm air felt lighter. Several craftsmen paused to drink from clay cups filled with cool water stored in shaded jars. The child accepted a small cup as well. The water tasted wonderfully fresh after the dusty warmth of the day. Simple comforts often felt richest because they followed honest work. No one drank carelessly. Each cup was filled only as needed. Water demanded respect. Everyone understood how precious it remained. The father continued repairing the plow while quietly explaining each step. Not through long speeches. Only a few gentle words. This beam carried too much weight. He pointed toward the worn wood. The crack began here. The child leaned closer. It looked small. The father nodded. It always does at first. He smiled softly. If you notice it early, the repair is easy. The child looked thoughtfully at the wood. Those words seemed to belong to more than farming tools. Small problems. Small mistakes. Small misunderstandings. Perhaps they all became easier when noticed early. The lesson settled quietly into memory. No one repeated it again. Across the workshop, an apprentice was carefully sweeping away fine wood shavings. The child noticed that he did not leave little piles hidden beneath the benches. Every corner was cleaned. Even places few people would see. An older carpenter noticed the child watching. He cleans well, the carpenter said quietly. Not because someone is looking. He smiled toward the apprentice. He cleans because tomorrow begins here. The child turned those words over slowly. Tomorrow begins here. The floor prepared today would welcome tomorrow's work. The tools returned to their proper places tonight would be easy to find at sunrise. The bread baked before dawn would feed the family by morning. Every day quietly prepared the next. Children rarely thought far into the future. Yet village life gently taught them that today's care became tomorrow's comfort. By late afternoon the father finished repairing the plow. Together they lifted it carefully. The wooden beam felt strong once more. The copper fittings rested firmly in place. The father ran one final hand across the smooth surface before standing. It will serve again. Only 4 simple words. The child noticed how much satisfaction those words carried. Repairing something brought quiet joy. Keeping useful things alive for another season mattered. Nothing was discarded without reason. As they stepped outside, the sunlight had softened. Long shadows stretched across the village road. The fiercest heat had finally begun to fade. Families slowly emerged from shaded homes to continue the lighter tasks of the evening. A group of women gathered near the riverbank washing linen garments. They worked together, kneeling beside smooth stones where flowing water helped carry away dust gathered during many days of labor. Their voices floated gently across the water. No one spoke loudly. The conversation wandered naturally from one simple subject to another. Someone mentioned a healthy newborn goat. Another spoke about a neighbor recovering from illness. Someone else wondered whether this year's flood might arrive a little earlier than the last. The child listened while helping carry a folded bundle of clean linen back toward home. These conversations held no great drama. Still, they stitched the village together. People remained connected because they shared ordinary days. At the edge of the river, several older boys were repairing a small reed boat. Only a few seasons before, they had floated tiny toy boats through shallow canals. Now they worked on one large enough to carry fishermen across the Nile. One carefully tied fresh reeds together. Another sealed small gaps with mud and plant fibers. Their hands moved with growing confidence. Nearby stood an elderly boat builder. He rarely interrupted. Only when a knot loosened or a bundle shifted too far did he quietly offer guidance. Children became skilled not because every mistake was prevented. They became skilled because patient adults allowed them to try again. The child watched one boy untie the same knot 3 times before finally securing it correctly. No one mocked him. No one hurried him. The boat builder simply waited. Learning followed its own pace. Like the Nile, it could not be forced. Farther along the bank, fishermen prepared their evening nets. The sun hung low above the western horizon now, bathing the river in warm amber light. The water appeared almost golden. Tiny ripples caught the light and carried it slowly downstream. One fisherman invited his young daughter to help fold the net. She had done this many times before. Her hands moved confidently through the fine cords, making sure nothing became tangled. When she finished, the fisherman gently nodded. No words. Just quiet trust. Trust often felt more valuable than praise. As children proved themselves dependable, adults gradually stepped back. Not all at once. Only little by little. One day a child carried a small basket. Months later, a larger one. Eventually no one noticed that the child had become someone others relied upon. The change happened too gently for a single moment to contain it. The father and child began walking home. Their shadows stretched long before them. The dusty road glowed softly beneath the evening light. Birds crossed overhead in slow, graceful lines as they returned to nests hidden among the palms. A cool breeze rose from the Nile once more. It carried away the last of the day's heat. The child breathed deeply. The evening always seemed to invite slower thoughts. During the busy morning there had been little time to notice the colors of the sky or the quiet songs of birds. Now everything seemed calmer. Perhaps work itself made these peaceful moments sweeter. The father suddenly stopped beside a large sycamore fig tree that had stood beside the road for generations. Its broad branches offered welcome shade even as daylight faded. He rested one hand upon its rough trunk. My father rested here. The child looked upward. The branches spread wide above them. And his father before him. For several moments neither spoke. The tree remained silent, holding memories no one could fully count. The father smiled. One day another child may stand here with you. The words drifted softly into the evening air. The child did not answer. The thought felt too large. Instead, both continued walking toward the village as the first evening stars quietly appeared overhead. The road remained the same. The river remained the same. The palms still sway gently in the cooling breeze. Yet with every ordinary day, every shared task, every quiet lesson offered through patient hands and calm voices, childhood slipped a little farther behind, not disappearing suddenly, but slowly blending into a life shaped by trust, habit, kindness, and the steady rhythm of ancient Egypt. The evening deepened with quiet grace. One by one, the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the western desert, leaving the village wrapped in gentle shades of amber, violet, and soft blue. The warmth stored inside the mud brick walls slowly drifted back into the cooling air. Palm leaves rustled overhead with a sound so light that it almost blended with the slow breathing of the Nile. The child and the father entered the familiar courtyard. The day's tools were carried carefully inside. Nothing was dropped carelessly. The repaired plow rested against the wall where it would remain dry until morning. The smaller hand tools were wiped free of dust before being returned to their places. A coil of rope was rolled neatly instead of being left upon the ground. These small actions seemed almost invisible. No one praised them. No one announced them. Yet they happened every evening. Children slowly learned that finishing a task also meant putting everything back in order. Work was not complete simply because the field had been left behind. The work ended only when every tool rested where it belonged. The mother was kneeling beside the clay oven. Its warmth still filled the courtyard with comforting heat. Fresh bread cooled upon woven trays while a pot of lentils simmered quietly over glowing coals. A handful of herbs floated gently across the surface, filling the evening air with a simple, welcoming fragrance. The child inhaled deeply. There were smells that belonged to every season. The sharp scent of newly cut reeds. The rich smell of wet earth after the Nile had flooded. The dusty fragrance carried across harvested fields. And always, at the close of the day, the smell of warm bread waiting beside the evening fire. These became memories long before anyone realized they were being made. The youngest brother wandered into the courtyard carrying a smooth stone he had discovered beside the canal. To him it seemed remarkable. Its shape fit perfectly inside his small hand. He proudly showed it to everyone. The father smiled. The grandmother turned it over thoughtfully before handing it back. "It has traveled a long way," she said quietly. "The river has been shaping it for many years." The little boy looked at the stone with new curiosity. It no longer seemed ordinary. The child listened carefully. The grandmother often spoke about simple things in ways that made them feel quietly important. "The river never hurries," she continued. "Yet even stone changes." Her words settled gently over the family. No one answered immediately. The child looked toward the Nile beyond the rooftops. Perhaps people changed in much the same way. Not all at once. Not through one great moment. Only through countless ordinary days. The evening meal was prepared slowly. Everyone gathered close together. The clay bowls were simple. Some had tiny chips along their edges from many years of careful use. Others had been repaired so skillfully that the cracks were barely visible. Nothing about the meal appeared grand. Yet every bite carried the work of many hands. The grain had been planted months before. The onions had grown patiently beneath the warm sun. The herbs had been gathered beside narrow irrigation canals. The water had been carried from the village well before sunrise. The child looked around quietly. Almost every object inside the home carried a story. The basket hanging from the wall had once belonged to the grandfather. The wooden spoon had been carved by a neighbor during a season of high floods. The clay jar near the doorway had survived many summers without breaking. Even ordinary belongings connected one generation to another. Children grew surrounded by these quiet histories. Sometimes they asked where an object had come from. Sometimes they simply accepted that it had always been there. As they ate, conversation drifted gently from one subject to another. The father spoke about a neighbor whose wheat had begun growing especially well this season. The mother mentioned that more linen thread would soon need spinning. The grandmother wondered whether the coming flood might leave especially rich soil along the eastern fields. No one spoke of distant rulers. No one discussed great battles. The concerns of ordinary families remained close to home. Enough grain. Healthy animals. Strong roofs. Reliable neighbors. Children listened closely to these conversations. Without realizing it, they began understanding what truly mattered within the village. When the meal ended, the child helped gather the empty bowls. Warm water was poured carefully over each one. A small cloth wiped away the last traces of food. Every bowl was dried before being stacked neatly together. The work took only a few minutes. Still, it happened every evening. Responsibility often lived inside these tiny moments. Across the lane, a soft voice began singing. An elderly woman rocked a baby gently in her arms. The melody floated across the quiet village like a slow breeze. It was not meant for an audience. it belonged only to the child she held. Even so, several nearby families smiled as they listened. Songs passed from parent to child just as surely as farming skills or fishing knowledge. Many melodies had no known beginning. They had simply always existed. Each generation remembered them, then quietly handed them forward. The child stepped outside once the chores were finished. Night had nearly arrived. Above, countless stars filled the sky with gentle light. Without city lamps or bright fires, the heavens seemed endless. The Milky Way stretched softly from one horizon to the other like a pale river flowing through darkness. The child often wondered whether the stars changed. The grandmother insisted they remained faithful. "They remind us where we are," she once said. "The river guides us on the earth. The stars guide us above it." Near the edge of the village, several older children sat together beneath a large date palm. Their work for the day had ended. Now they spoke quietly while weaving strips of palm leaves into small baskets. Even during rest, hands often remained busy. One boy laughed softly after making a crooked weave. Another patiently showed him how to tighten the pattern. No one minded beginning again. Practice itself felt familiar. The child joined them. Small fingers worked carefully through the fresh leaves. The weaving was not perfect. A corner bent unevenly. One strip slipped loose. An older girl smiled kindly. "Try again." Only those 2 words. The child carefully loosened the weave and started once more. This time the pattern held. The basket remained small. Far too small for carrying grain or vegetables. Still, it represented something important. Skill always began with humble attempts. Nearby, an old shepherd slowly walked home with the last of his goats. The animals knew the path without guidance. They wandered through the familiar gate almost on their own. The shepherd carried only a simple wooden staff polished smooth by many years of use. The child watched him disappear into the fading light. The shepherd had likely followed the same path thousands of times. Morning after morning. Evening after evening. His life had been shaped by repetition. Yet there was something peaceful about that thought. Not every life needed constant change. Sometimes deep happiness grew from familiar routines performed with care. The cool night breeze strengthened. It carried the fresh scent of river reeds and damp soil. The heat of the day had finally released its hold upon the land. Families gathered outside their homes to enjoy the comfortable air before sleep. Some repaired clothing. Others twisted fresh rope from flax fibers. An elderly couple quietly shelled beans into a clay bowl. Children sat nearby listening to stories told in calm, unhurried voices. The grandmother began speaking once more. This time she remembered her own childhood. She described carrying tiny bundles of firewood that had once seemed impossibly heavy. She smiled gently. "I thought they would always feel that way." The child looked toward the neatly stacked firewood beside the wall. It no longer seemed heavy at all. "You will discover," the grandmother continued, "that many difficult things become ordinary if you greet them a little each day." The child considered her words. Perhaps this explained almost everything. Learning to carry water. Grinding grain. Walking long distances. Helping in the fields. Watching younger brothers. None had become easy in a single morning. They had become familiar because they were repeated with quiet patience. The grandmother leaned back comfortably. "When we are young," she said softly, "we believe we become older through birthdays." She smiled toward the stars. "But I think we grow older through mornings." The child looked at her with quiet curiosity. Each sunrise asks for one small thing. One small kindness. One small task. One small lesson. After enough mornings, we wake to discover that we have quietly become someone others can depend upon. No one hurried to answer. The night itself seemed to hold her words gently in the cool air. Far beyond the village, the Nile continued its endless journey beneath the stars. Its calm waters reflected both the moon and the ancient constellations above. The same river had watched countless children wake before dawn, carry water, sweep courtyards, gather grain, mend baskets, comfort younger siblings, and slowly exchange carefree moments for dependable habits. It had witnessed the change so many times that it no longer seemed like a sudden event at all. Instead, childhood faded as softly as evening light, leaving the fields almost impossible to notice while it was happening, yet unmistakable once another peaceful day had quietly become another peaceful year beneath the gentle sky of ancient Egypt. The stars remained above the village long after every doorway had grown quiet. Their light rested softly upon the rooftops, the narrow paths between homes, and the broad surface of the Nile. A cool breeze wandered through the date palms, stirring their leaves with a slow whisper that blended with the gentle sound of water moving along the riverbank. Inside the family home, everyone slept. The oil lamp had burned low before finally becoming dark. Only the faint silver light of the moon entered through the open doorway, touching the clay jars, the woven baskets, and the smooth wooden handles of the tools resting against the wall. The child turned slightly upon the reed mat. The body was tired in the pleasant way that follows honest work. Arms felt heavy. Feet still remembered the rough ground of the fields. The smell of warm earth lingered softly in the room. Sleep came easily after days that followed a steady rhythm. Outside, the village seemed almost timeless. No voices. No hurried footsteps. Only the occasional sound of a night bird calling across the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, a fisherman guided a small boat through the moonlit water. His paddle entered the river almost silently, creating gentle circles that slowly widened before disappearing once again. He had chosen the quiet hours because the river offered a different kind of peace at night. The current felt slower. The air felt cooler. The stars provided faithful companions during the long journey across the water. His young son sat near the front of the boat. The boy had not always been allowed to come. Years earlier he had remained safely at home while his father worked through the darkness. At first he was considered too small. Then one season he was invited to watch. Another season he learned how to untangle ropes. Now he helped guide the boat through familiar channels. The father never announced that his son had become ready. One quiet responsibility simply followed another. The river itself seemed to decide the pace. Back in the village, the child slept peacefully, unaware that tomorrow would bring another ordinary day filled with similar lessons. That was often how childhood changed. No single experience transformed everything. Instead, each day placed another small stone upon a path already stretching into the future. Before dawn, the grandmother awoke. Age had changed her sleep. She often rose while the stars still filled the sky. She stepped quietly outside, wrapping a light linen shawl around her shoulders against the cool morning air. For a few moments she simply stood in the courtyard. She looked upward. The familiar constellations rested where they always had. She had watched these same stars as a child. She had watched them while carrying water beside her own mother. She had watched them after long harvests, during years of plentiful grain and during seasons when the river had risen less generously. The stars had remained steady while generations quietly came and went. She smiled gently. There was comfort in things that endured. Soon the first pale light appeared along the eastern horizon. Another day prepared to begin. The grandmother returned inside and stirred the embers left beneath yesterday's cooking fire. With careful hands she added small pieces of dry wood gathered the evening before. Tiny flames appeared. Slowly. Patiently. The warmth spread through the room. The child opened sleepy eyes. The familiar glow of the fire greeted another morning. There was never confusion about what came next. The sequence had become part of life. Fold the sleeping cloth. Roll the reed mat. Wash the face. Help prepare the day. Routine quietly removed uncertainty. The child enjoyed these first quiet moments before the village fully awakened. The air felt clean. The sounds remained gentle. The day's heat had not yet arrived. Outside, the eastern sky slowly brightened. Birds began calling to one another from the tops of palm trees. Goats stirred inside their shelters. The first donkey shook its head, making the simple rope tied around its neck brush softly against the wooden post. Morning always arrived little by little. The mother handed the child a small basket. "We need herbs today." Her voice remained calm. The child nodded. Together they walked toward the edge of the cultivated fields where fresh herbs grew beside narrow irrigation channels. The path crossed soft earth still cool from the night. Tiny droplets of moisture rested upon a few broad leaves near the water. The child bent down to look more closely. Such small drops would disappear as soon as the sun climbed higher. Some beautiful things lasted only a short while. The mother carefully selected each herb. She never gathered more than the family required. The child noticed this. There were many plants growing nearby. Still, she left plenty behind. Respect for the land revealed itself through quiet habits. Take what is needed. Leave what can continue growing. The lesson required no explanation. As they worked, the child heard another family approaching. A little girl about the same age carried a basket almost identical to the one held by the child. She smiled shyly. Both children knelt beside the same patch of herbs. For several peaceful minutes they worked side by side. Then the other girl whispered softly, "My father says I will begin helping at the market soon." The child looked up. "The market?" She nodded proudly. "I will count onions and dates." The child smiled. "That sounds important." The little girl looked thoughtful. "I hope I remember everything." The child understood. New responsibilities always brought a little uncertainty. Not fear. Simply the quiet wish to do well. The mothers listened while continuing their work. Neither interrupted. They knew such conversations mattered. Children often measured their growing years not by age but by new tasks. The first trip alone to the well. The first basket carried to market. The first season helping in the harvest. The first younger sibling trusted to their care. These moments quietly marked the passing of childhood. On the walk home, the child thought about the market. There were so many things to remember there. Weights. Measurements. Greetings. Prices agreed upon through patient conversation. Merchants seemed to carry endless knowledge inside their memories. Perhaps they had once worried too. Perhaps every experienced adult had once stood uncertain before a new responsibility. The thought felt comforting. Back in the village, preparations for the day continued. The baker removed fresh loaves from the oven. Their warm crusts crackled softly as cooler air touched them. The potter arranged newly dried bowls beneath the sunlight. Children carried bundles of reeds toward a nearby workshop. An elderly woman spread linen cloth across a flat roof where the morning breeze would help it dry. The whole village seemed to awaken together, every household contributing to the gentle rhythm. The child accompanied the father to the village storehouse. Several families gathered there to organize sacks of grain from the previous harvest. The building remained cool inside despite the growing warmth outside. Thick mud brick walls protected the precious stores from the strongest heat. The air smelled of grain, straw, dry earth, and woven baskets. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of sunlight entering from small openings high above. The father lifted one sack carefully. The child reached for another much smaller bundle. Years ago the child would only have watched. Now there was useful work to perform. Not heavy enough to cause harm. Just enough to contribute. An elderly keeper of the storehouse noticed. He smiled kindly. Every harvest begins with small hands. The child looked up curiously. The old man continued arranging baskets before speaking again. And every village grows strong because those small hands become steady ones. His words were simple. The child carried them quietly while placing another bundle where it belonged. No one became dependable in a single season. Dependability grew through repetition. One careful task. Then another. Then another. Morning after morning. Year after year. As the sun climbed higher and warm light filled the storehouse doorway, the child realized that nearly every adult in the village had once stood in exactly the same place carrying something just a little too heavy, trying to remember each new responsibility, hoping to earn another quiet nod of trust and that perhaps childhood did not disappear because someone took it away, but because each ordinary day gently offered something meaningful to carry until both the hands and the heart had slowly grown strong enough to hold it. The day slowly gave itself back to the evening. The last baskets were carried home. The final tools were wiped clean and rested quietly against familiar walls. Cooking fires glowed with a soft orange light, sending gentle ribbons of smoke into the calm air above the village. One by one, families gathered beneath their rooftops, sharing simple meals prepared by hands that had followed the same peaceful rhythm for countless seasons. The Nile flowed beside them, just as it always had. It asked for nothing. It hurried no one. It simply continued its endless journey beneath the wide Egyptian sky. The child, who had awakened so many mornings with new responsibilities waiting, now sat quietly beside the river for a few peaceful moments before returning home. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of reeds and fresh water. Tiny ripples reflected the first stars appearing overhead. Somewhere nearby, a fisherman folded his nets for the night. A shepherd closed the gate to a small enclosure where sleepy goats settled together. A mother covered tomorrow's grain with linen. A father checked that every tool rested safely where it belonged. An old grandmother looked toward the stars, smiling at familiar constellations that had watched over her since she herself had once been a little child. No one spoke about childhood disappearing. No one marked the moment it quietly slipped away. There had been no single morning when games suddenly ended. No afternoon when laughter vanished. No evening when a child became an adult with one great step. Instead, it had happened gently. A basket carried one season. A water jar balanced the next. A younger brother comforted. A neighbor helped. A field tended. A loaf baked. A tool repaired. A promise remembered. A quiet lesson learned. Each ordinary day had added one small thread. Together those threads became the fabric of a dependable life. The rules that once seemed like little reminders had slowly become habits. Those habits became character. Character became trust. and trust became the quiet gift shared from one generation to the next. The village would wake again before dawn. The grinding stones would sing their familiar song. Bread would rise beside warm ovens. The river would welcome fishermen into its gentle current. Children would laugh for a little while before helping their families. New lessons would arrive without ceremony. Old wisdom would pass from patient voices into listening hearts. The cycle would continue, just as it always had. The mud brick homes would weather many summers. Palm trees would sway through many seasons. The Nile would flood, retreat, and return again. Children yet unborn would one day follow the same dusty paths, pause beneath the same broad trees, and watch the same stars reflected upon quiet water. Most would never know the names of those who had walked before them. Yet they would inherit their kindness, their patience, their steady hands, their careful routines. In that gentle way, ordinary people left behind something far greater than monuments of stone. They left behind ways of living that quietly shaped every new morning. Now the village grows still. The last voices soften into whispers. The cooking fires fade into glowing embers. The breeze moves gently through the reeds, carrying only the peaceful sound of the river flowing through the ancient night. Above, countless stars shine with calm, steady light. Below, the Nile continues its quiet journey, reflecting the moon as it has for thousands of years. And somewhere inside a simple mud brick home, a child tired from an ordinary day filled with ordinary work closes sleepy eyes, wrapped in the warmth of family, the comfort of familiar routines, and the peaceful certainty that tomorrow, like today, will arrive gently with the first light over the timeless waters of the Nile. So the ancient night grows deeper. The village rests. The river whispers softly. The warm desert wind drifts across the quiet fields. And history, never in a hurry, slowly settles into silence, carrying one more peaceful day into memory beneath the endless stars.